Donc, je vous présenterai notre premier intervenant et mon keynote speaker, 1Dikec, qui vit entre Paris et Londres, qui est un universitaire intergalactique parce qu'il a commencé sa carrière en Turquie, il a fait sa thèse aux États-Unis et qu'il enseigne à Londres tout en vivant à Paris. Et qui a écrit un livre tout à fait remarquable sur la banlieue Badlands of the Republic, qui est paru en 2007. 1Dikec fait partie du département de géographie de Royal Holloway, qui fait partie de l'Université de Londres. Il nous parlera aujourd'hui de Trend from UK Policy and Politics. Donc, je laisse la parole à 1Dikec.
Can you all hear me? That's the time. So, thank you very much to Kristen and Bruno for organizing this event and to the Institute for their hospitality. And thank you very much for coming. It's doing something that's not supposed to do. Yeah. I think we have a wonderful variety of people here from different academic disciplines. My talk reflects the perspective of a geographer. So what I'll try to do in 40-45 minutes is to give an interpretation of the question of banlieue, and in particular the banlieue revolts, from a geographical perspective and also with a political focus. What is at stake politically in the banlieue revolts and the state's responses to them? This is the question that will... Why is this doing this? Why is it doing this?
Because it's probably started the slideshow. Somehow it is doing a slideshow.
Sorry. Fine. It's very stressful, not longer. All right. I'll start with a seemingly unrelated story and try to draw some political implications from it. Castella has a big mustache and he does vulgar jokes. He doesn't like reading. He doesn't like the theater. He spends his day at a factory which belongs to him and his evenings at the theater to which he seemingly doesn't belong. His unrefined ways, lack of education and artistic culture make him an object of ridicule when he joins the artists for dinner after the spectacle, with the hope of gaining the sympathy of the lead actress, Clara, with whom he has fallen madly in love. But they seem worlds apart. Castella's efforts seem to merely consolidate his position as a joking matter in this artistic milieu. In yet another effort to be close to Clara, Castella attends an exhibition by one of her painter friends and buys a painting. But how could this mustachio industrialist have a taste for painting not induced by some other motivation? The painter's boyfriend believes that Castella felt obliged to buy it after having unwittingly insulted him and his boyfriend, the painter, with a pejorative remark on gays. Clara thinks Castella is buying art to impress her, but Castella goes even further. He commissions the painter to paint a mural on the facade of his factory, which happens to be a paint factory. Although the painter's boyfriend believes that Castella has commissioned his boyfriend because he appreciates his art, Clara thinks they are taking advantage of his feelings towards her. I know Castella, she says. He doesn't appreciate it. He doesn't know a thing. But when she visits the factory to put an end to this exploitation, as she sees it, Castella surprises her by telling that he actually likes the paintings, and that's why he's buying them. You didn't think for a minute it could be because I like them. Don't worry, he says to Clara. It's because I like him. Now Clara is speechless. Even this uneducated, vulgar factory owner who doesn't know, as she said, is saying, has taste, has aesthetic taste. He is not, as she wrongly believed, trying to satisfy the taste of others, the film's title, but his own. There is something egalitarian here. Castella is capable of making judgments of taste, just like her painter friend and all the others. Now, what political lessons can be drawn from this seemingly unrelated story? There is one obvious route to take. We could follow Bourdieu and read this as a critique of taste. We would then see poor Castella as humiliated and oppressed because of his lack of taste, which is the result of his lack of education, cultural capital, and so on. This would then imply a politics that will denounce all grantors and grounds for privilege, like elite schools, social, cultural, and institutional structure. And in this sense, it will be an egalitarian politics with equality as its objective. Now, this is a fine politics, I think, but it denies all capacity to Castella, who can only play the role of poor Castella in this scenario. Indeed, he has to remain only that for the critique to have any legitimacy at all. If there is any hope for emancipation for Castella, it will come from the critique's denunciation of markers of such privilege and distinction. Now, can we make Castella play a different role, a part where he emancipates himself, by demonstrating a capacity that is denied to him? In other words, what does it mean politically if we accept Castella, to accept Castella as an equal? Now this question of equality is key to Jacques Rancière's work, Understanding of Politics, which has been very influential for my own work. And he provides us, as you can, I'm not going to read all of it, he provides us with a very spatial understanding of politics. I can summarize this or give you my own interpretation of this, of how I conceive of politics: manifestation of equality and resisting the givenness of place. These two, for me, are key to the question of politics, and we will see in the remainder of the presentation that both of these are at play in the case of banlieue, which are constructed as a particular kind of place over the years through not only journalistic accounts, but more importantly, in my view, through the state's discourses, what I call the statements of the state. Now, what kind of a place is this? Let me tell you another story to explicate what kind of a place this is, that is to be resisted. In the summer of 2004, France was shocked by a sensational news. A young woman traveling with her baby on a banlieue train, the RER, was attacked and mugged by a group of North African and black youth. Upon seeing the address on her identity card, the attackers deduced that she lives in a rich area and must therefore be Jewish. From that point on, the attack takes on an anti-Semite form, with the attackers drawing swastikas on her, cutting her hair, and making marks on her face with a knife. No one on the train attempts to protect her or her baby, and no one even pulls the alarm. Now, a public outrage immediately followed. This was then turned into a movie, followed the incident for the next couple of days, included many shocked remarks by politicians. The source of outrage was not what the youth did, but the passivity of other passengers. It was as if we all knew that the banlieue youth does that kind of thing. But how to account for the conduct of other passengers, who not only failed to intervene, okay, perhaps they were scared, but who did not even come forward to testify after the incident? In the midst of such growing reactions to the incident, no one really thought about another possibility. Perhaps there was nothing to do, simply because nothing happened. This possibility was not raised, as the story fit only too well with the stereotypical images of and prejudices against the banlieue and the banlieue youth. the significant point here is that it was this image, this stereotypical image of the banlieue that motivated the comments and responses of the politicians and the media rather than the facts of the story, which at the time were not even established yet. After 2 days, the young woman admitted to inventing the whole story. This non-event, I believe, is an example that illustrates this place assigned to the banlieues and banlieue habitats. But this obviously, and that's one of my points, this obviously is not the natural order of things. Now, to come back to a point I started, in the case of banlieue revolts in France, we see in my interpretation both a denial of political capacity, I'll call this voices into noises, and the construction of banlieues as particular places, as somehow places of violence where revolts or riots naturally occur. But as we will see, this construction hides from perspective what I call geographies of grievances. So, as a geographer, I think to me the interesting thing is that there's an important overlap between the geographies of revolts and geographies of what I call grievances. So, in short, what I'm trying to say is, if the banlieues are revolting, it's because the conditions are revolting. Now, over the years, the images of banlieue have been articulated in a variety of ways. We know that the term banlieue is originally a geographical administrative term and is not necessarily pejorative. Furthermore, I think that some of the papers today and tomorrow will address this issue. There's a rich variety of banlieues. We can't really talk about the banlieue. This is in the banlieue. This is in the banlieue. But somehow we end up with this stereotypical image of the banlieue, which somehow persists. Now, this image itself has gone through changes over the years, and I think it's possible to observe some of these changes in the media and popular culture. Again, I think some of the participants will talk about this in more detail. But just to give you a quick example, this is an Express cover story from 1970s. Thugs are talking to you at the gates of big cities, thousands of hoodlums are produced. So this image of the banlieue thugs, which are white in the 70s, I'm just showing this as an illustration of this shift into the 90s, where the question gets tied into immigration and also explicitly and later on implicitly to Islam. So this is one example. If you want another example from popular culture, this shift from the 70s into the 90s and later on is from the Waltzers, which is not a banlieue movie actually, as the title of the movie suggests. It's about sexual liberation. But the opening scene is that these are the two thugs of the 70s where they terrorize a young middle-aged woman in a banlieue. So the shift from the Waltzers to hate from the 70s to 90s and later on. I think this is all very interesting and helpful, but what interests me here is not just these journalistic or popular cultural accounts, but as I said at the beginning, the statements of the state. How the banlieue, in the singular, was constituted first as an object of policy, and then as an object of fear, menace, and threat. What I'm interested in, therefore, is states' policies, in particular urban policy, and other statements of the state. I see urban policy and other statements of the state as particular regimes of representation that consolidate a certain spatial order through practices of articulation, spatially designating areas to be treated, associating problems with them, and generating a certain discourse to think about them, although there are, as we know, other kinds of discourses. In this sense, these practices, these statements of the state are place-making practices which consolidate a certain spatial order and the particular way to think about it. So following Rancière, I refer to this consolidated spatial order as the police in its original non-pejorative sense. Now let's very quickly go to the area where Lahaine was shot. The story takes place in a banlieue called Chanteloup-les-Vignes. It's in the Paris region, located 30 kilometers to the northwest of Paris. Before they constructed this a state project. Chanteloup was a village of 2,500 people. The construction started in 1966, and it was a top-down project imposed by the planners of the state, like arguably many others at the time. What's interesting here for me is the contrast between what existed there, a village of 2,500 people, and what this top-down project brought in. I think the contrast, we see it here. So up there you see what existed and what was brought in. So this image shows this sharp contrast more clearly, how massive top-down the project was. And I think it wasn't the only one at the time. Chanteloup was a village-like place with 2,500 people. The new project brought 8,000 inhabitants to this banlieue. Now imagine the demographic, economic and social consequences or cultural consequences of such a rapid and remarkable change. Here you're living in your village of 2,500 people. In the space of a few years, 8,000 new people are there. I think this sometimes escapes from perspective because of the dominant images, stereotypical images of the banlieues. Now, it wasn't bad, you know, as you can see here. They were massive blocks, but some of them were very elegant, loaded with cultural references. So these are some images from Chanteloup. So the reason I'm showing this is I think it's important for us to keep in mind this massive change and maybe arguably ill preparation of these projects, and to avoid, when we talk about the problems of banlieue, such simplistic explanations. Personally, I blame it all on Le Corbusier after a riot. Okay, so I think it's best to avoid these kinds of explanations. Now, many of these problems that we have seen in the banlieues were to be expected because of this massive and arguably ill-prepared change. And the problems became much more clear with the changes in the economy when France's economic growth began to slow down. Now what I'll do is I'll tell you a very quick and very simplistic, very simplified story of French urban policy and the French banlieue revolts. The story I'm going to tell starts in the early 1980s, although I'm not suggesting that there weren't any incidents before that, there were. However, it was in the early 1980s that we experienced unprecedented, spectacular revolting, and the issue became a policy problem, although the policymakers were aware of these issues. And there were particular reasons for this. You may remember the incidents took place in the 3Bs, the 3 suburbs of Lyon. What was peculiar, I think this is important in the articulation of the stereotypical images of the banlieue, is that these incidents in the so-called hot summer of 1981 took place in a very peculiar context. So the left is in power for the first time in the Fifth Republic. People talk about the immigration problem. And the left have a very contentious political agenda. They want to abolish capital punishment, which they did. They want to stop the expulsion of immigrants, which they did. And they want to give voting rights to strangers in local elections, which they never did. Always promised, never did. And they want to introduce self-management, autogestion. So it is this very tense context, and suddenly we have this so-called hot summer with banlieue incidents in the banlieue. So what did this state do? This state responded to these incidents by instituting an urban policy program which was unprecedented in many ways. So it was guided by ideas of right to the city. It was the work of militants whom they called the foot soldiers of democracy. That's a very interesting phrase, foot soldiers of democracy, with an aim to create a political dynamic in these areas. And it turns out they had already Lefebvre, so they were very much influenced by the ideas of Lefebvre. But it wasn't just the national context that was interesting. A few months before the French incidents, there was rioting in Brixton, and I think most people here are French, so you must be familiar with this real French obsession with race and the wrong-headed way of the so-called Anglo-Saxons. The Brixton riots were seen as race riots. It was the black people rioting. So there was a great uneasiness on the other side of the channel, because people are very worried. Will we have the same kind of thing? Although we can't, because this is one indivisible republic. Now, what's important here is, again, it's a simplified story, but we have this instance, particular context. The state, what the state does is, okay, let's start a policy program with political ideas. I think that was very important. We will see how this will change. Yeah? Going back to 1990s, again, this is a period of very particular political context. 90s is important because we have spectacular rioting in Guam, in one of the showcase neighborhoods of urban policy. But the context is peculiar. We have the riots in Guam, we have the Rushdie affair, Salman Rushdie affair the year before. We have the Islamic Whale affair, LA riots will take place, the Gulf War is about to start, and the Intifada has been in place. So what all of this means is that suddenly the question of banlieues become articulated with issues of immigration and Islam. And how does the state respond this time? They create a ministry for the city, which I think was an interesting idea. But at the same time, we see in this period that the Ministry of Justice, and more importantly the French intelligence service, starts to engage with the question of banlieues. So suddenly we have a very different image of banlieues with the engagement of these hardcore state institutions who have traditionally been dealing with terrorism. In the meantime, the situation in the banlieues, especially in the neighborhoods of urban policy, did not really improve. And for all of France, the situation did not improve. But as you can see here, in the social housing neighborhoods of urban policy, these areas were really hit by rising unemployment, where almost 4 people in 10 in the young population were unemployed in some of the cases. And suddenly all of these went from perspective, and later on the state responses changed very dramatically after this point. And early ideal politicals disappeared, right to the city, foot soldiers. So whereas they used to send militants, the so-called foot soldiers of democracy, to the banlieues, the state started sending almost real, I don't think it's a real soldier, but almost real soldiers. We started sending the Robocop, and this marked a real, this is, especially, we have seen this with the 2005 revolts, and I think there are some papers about this. This was to me a major change in the state's responses to the banlieue revolts. The shift from right to the city, full soldiers of democracy, to Robocop. And of course, what the Express cover predicted became a reality with the declaration of state of emergency. We have replaced policy with police. Now, what are the political implications of this change? And this is what I call voices into noises. With this construction of banlieue as a threat, as a menace, the political voices were turned into noises that didn't make sense, didn't claim anything politically. What do I mean by this? I'll give you an example. Now, when people here demonstrate, when they use violence, it's not to have fun, it's never to harm anybody, it's because they are desperate, because they no longer have any option, and they feel condemned to economic and social debt. This is Sarkozy after riots in Lorient in April 2007. So what's he saying? He's saying if these guys are looting and burning, there are legitimate reasons for that. It couldn't get any better than this, but what is he talking about? Fishermen don't cheat. Yeah? When they riot, they have a right to do so. There must be some good reasons. And this is the response to the banlieue youth when they loot and burn. They are scum and thugs. So this is what I mean by turning. There's no, to him now, and I think this is a dominant image in many ways, to him there is no political message in this, it's just mindless looting and burning. Whereas the fishermen, when they do, there are good reasons, and peasants as well, when they destroy the railways, they are angry because there's a good reason for that. Now, this is a dramatic change in state response to banlieue revolts. But the funny thing is, not the funny, but the dramatic thing is, the original causes of problems have not changed over the years, since at least the early 80s. We still have mass employment in these areas, up to 40%. Discrimination and very strong territorial stigmatization, what's called the adverse effects. Police violence and impunity. I think this is key. I think I will take a minute to talk about this. You may all remember how the 2005 revolts began. Death of young banlieue inhabitants, the darker ones, where the police was implicated. Now this has been a common pattern in the banlieue revolts. Out of the 48 big revolts of the 1990s, 34 of them were provoked by killing. And in at least 30 of those, this is data from French intelligence service, yeah? In at least 30 of them, the police is implicated. I'm not saying guilty, implicated. Now this is a huge number. 48 revolts, because 34 involved killing, and in 30 of them, the police is implicated. Several other revolts in the years 2000 followed the same pattern, including the massive revolts of autumn 2005, Villiers-le-Bel in 2007, and Grenoble in 2010. Part of the youth's resentment stems from the apparent impunity of the police, with a perception of the police as being above the law. For example, the policeman who killed a youth of North African origin in Nantes-le-Joli in 1991 was only tried in 2001, 10 years later, which contradicted the state's stated commitment to swift, firm, and tough response in the domain of justice, and consolidated the already established perception of impunity of the police. The case was eventually dismissed. The two policemen implicated in the death of two adolescents in Clichy-sous-Bois, which was the triggering incident for the 2005 revolts, also benefited from a similar decision, dismissed 6 years after the incident. The 5 young banlieue inhabitants arrested after the 2007 Villiers-le-Bel revolts, however, were less lucky. They have received a swift, firm, and tough response from justice. 3 to 15 years in prison, announced in 2010, despite great concern about the lack of solid proof, since the accusations were based on anonymous and paid denunciations and statements by the captured youth made during their 4-day police custody. After 4 days in police custody, I'm sure many of us would admit to lots of strange things. This is now another form of violence that the state officials rarely, if ever, talk about when they refer to banlieue revolts. Another thing is surveillance by, constant surveillance and repression, especially surveillance by the French intelligence service. Now, if this is the case, why riot? Why conduct these things? Now, this is a particular bête noire of mine. We tend to hear this a lot, because the youth are bored, they want to be seen on TV. Now, I think this is simply wrong, and for at least 2 reasons. First of all, as we have seen, the geography of riots is an expanding geography. So we had 5 big-scale riots or revolts in the 1980s. We had 48 in the 1990s, plus 300, what the French intelligence service calls mini-émeutes. And in 2005, the riots touched about 300 communes, a geographical expansion. If we are to accept the reason that behind these there is boredom and desire to be seen on the TV, the only logical explanation for this geographical expansion would be that more people were bored in 2005 than in the 1980s. I can't say that I find this very convincing. So this is one reason. And second, imagine this situation in a cold autumn night. You live up there. Would you go down to face these guys just because you're bored and want to be seen on TV? I don't think that's very convincing. So I think this is the second sort of simplistic explanation that I think we need to get rid of in explaining or thinking about the banlieue revolts. In my view, you don't need to read all of this, but in my view, the best explanation of banlieue revolts is this. So there are all these problems of exclusion, feeling of resentment, and then all you need is a spark, because this resentment is like gunpowder, and the spark, usually the triggering incident, is the death of your pal in the banlieue. Who said this? The creator of Cities and Banlieue section in the French intelligence service, Lucien Boutron. Now, I think this is the best explanation, although I don't agree with her answers, obviously, but I think this is one of the best explanations of this. My own explanation for the reasons behind the banlieue revolts is a bit formulaic. We see the injuries of the past, and we see, especially that relate to France's colonial history, difficulties of present, mass unemployment, discrimination, territorial stigmatization, constant harassment by the police, and that kind of thing, and anxiety about the future. What's going to happen? What are our urban futures? Now, if Abdel is right, this is very sad and dangerous, and I think sending in the Robocop will only add insult to injury. And here Abdel is talking about the youth's relations with the police in this banlieue of Lyon. Now I would like to, because I suspect some people will ask about this if I don't talk about it. What is to be done? Some people already have an answer. This is not an answer I really share. My sense is that part of the solution involves the dismantling of what I call this police order that has been consolidated over the years. Now, by confining the other into a geographical elsewhere, by closing the banlieue onto itself with these stereotypical images, this spatial order not only removed from perspective the structural dynamics of persistent inequalities, but also reconfigured the givens of the situation by representing the banlieue in itself as a problem, treating the claims coming from the banlieues not as voices that question the order of things, but as noises that disturb the established order. The challenge, it seems to me, is to, this is why I started with Castella and the question of equality. Yeah? The challenge, it seems to me, is to hear these voices as claims made up on the political community by its equal members, and not as a threat coming from barbarians at the gate. The challenge, it seems to me, is to imagine our urban features in another way, based on a different spatial order. Once again, it is to hear these voices as claims made upon the political community by its equal members, and not as a threat coming from the barbarians at the gate. Barbarians may provide an easy solution, but the political question, I believe, is about avoiding such easy solutions. Thank you very much.
So we have about 15 minutes for the questions and discussion before we have a little coffee break. So I invite you to ask questions or comments. It's possible maybe to give the microphone to the room if you want, because we have another one. Vous pouvez aussi commenter ou poser des questions en français, donc ça peut être, comme a dit, le colloque est bilingue, vous pouvez utiliser la langue que vous préférez, et en fait on est presque tous bilingues, enfin en tout cas les.
Moi je réponds en turc.
D'accord, ça va être très difficile.
Moi, je veux bien poser une question de langue, alors, parce que j'aime beaucoup cette phrase « geographies of grievance », mais je pense que ce serait utile, peut-être, c'est nécessaire, voilà. Je pose une question de langue, de traduction, de bilinguisme sur cette phrase « Geographies of Grievances », parce qu'en fait, on m'a posé la question un peu en voix off, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Donc je pense que ça peut être utile de proposer des traductions et puis de dire un peu pourquoi ce choix de mot « grievances ».
Tu veux dire en français?
Oui, vers le français.
Ouais.
Comment traduire ça vers le français? Et puis pourquoi ce mot grievances? Parce que ça me semble un mot très intéressant, pas très habituel, et donc chargé de sens.
Oui.
Et je pense que ça peut être intéressant déjà de savoir un peu plus. Donc c'est pas vraiment une question, c'est une sollicitation.
Non, mais c'est très bien. Il faut que je réponde. Mais, en français, ça va. Mieux en anglais. Je ne sais pas comment on dit ça en français.
Moi aussi j'ai hésité.
En fait, j'ai jamais pensé parce que quand j'ai écrit ça, j'ai écrit en anglais. Et je pense que en fait, je découvre en moi-même des qualités qui ont resté cachées pendant ces années, qui sont très inutiles d'ailleurs, c'est arriver à faire des phrases en anglais qui ne sont pas traduisibles en français. Et c'est très nul. Donc là, l'une de ces phrases, en fait, givenness of place. Là, c'est impossible à traduire. Givenness of place, comment on traduit ça? Donc, j'avais du mal avec ça déjà. Donc, j'ai un peu pensé à ça, j'ai pas pu trouver de solution. Geographies of Grievances, il faut, honnêtement, franchement, j'ai pas pensé en français. Parce que quand j'écris, c'est en anglais. Et le mot, j'ai choisi, j'ai bien réfléchi. C'est grievance, pour moi, c'était très important. Et, en fait, c'est. Vous voyez, peut-être il y a un lien avec doléances. Peut-être je pense à doléances, parce qu'il y a cette histoire, cahier de doléances et tout ça. Donc, peut-être une sorte d'enregistrement. Voilà, en fait, oui, c'était doléance. C'était doléance. Je pense que c'est mon idée, mon ambition politique, c'est il faut aussi qu'on enregistre ces doléances qu'on enregistrait sur un cahier, mais je ne sais pas, il faut trouver des formats, des moyens. Mais parce que c'est ça qui... On laisse pas de traces de ça. On en parle un peu après, il y a autre chose. Donc, est-ce que... Voilà. Très bien. Merci parce que ça me...
Ça me va très bien.
Mais ça me va très
génial.
bien.
Doléance, j'en ai pas pensé.
Ouais.
Je trouve ça très... Merci.
Merci pour votre intervention. J'ai une question. J'avais une question en fait, assez précise. À un moment donné, vous articulez sur la question de la projection, rapport au passé, au présent et au futur, qui est la question essentielle, la question des parcs sociales, comment elles se construisent. Et vous avez parlé justement des blessures du passé. Et donc, est-ce que... Alors moi, je suis doctorant en histoire, donc ça m'intéresse tout de suite. Et est-ce que vous auriez des clés par rapport en fait à ces représentations justement du passé que vous avez pu trouver dans les entretiens?
Oui.
Problème de reconnaissance, la question des post-colonial studies, etc. qui peut se poser. Est-ce que vous avez trouvé des choses dans vos études?
Merci, c'est très bien parce que je t'en parle. En fait, l'idée m'est venue après les entretiens avec militants associatifs. Donc, il y en avait surtout pas tous, mais certains, surtout d'origine, disons, maghrébin ou africain, ou je ne sais pas. Il y avait vraiment ce discours très très fort, et certains parlaient même d'une gestion coloniale des quartiers. Je pense que c'est très fort, ça m'a beaucoup marqué, c'est pour ça que en fait, on m'a beaucoup posé la question quand j'ai écrit le livre, pourquoi j'ai pas allé chercher des idées dans la littérature post-colonialisme et tout ça. Donc, que j'aime beaucoup d'ailleurs, mais cette idée, moi, en fait, je voulais dire que en fait, cette idée de colonialisme, c'est très très fort parmi certains. Maintenant, c'est plus des jeunes, hein, je sais que c'est déjà peut-être 40 ans maintenant, mais là, il y a vraiment une blessure parce que j'ai senti qu'ils avaient vraiment ils avaient la haine, voilà. Ils avaient la haine pour deux raisons. D'abord parce qu'ils pensaient que leurs parents avaient été exploités, humiliés par, il faut le dire, ils pensaient ça. Et il disait, on ne rase pas les murs, c'est leur mot, on ne rase pas les murs, donc on fait des revendications, alors qu'on n'entend que des bruits, hein, on n'entend pas de... Et eux aussi, ils avaient des... C'est Abdel qui m'a dit, la guerre d'Algérie en France, c'est pas fini, et il m'a parlé de relations entre la police et les jeunes. Donc il y a une grosse, une énorme tension. Et donc je pense que c'est bien sûr, parce que les parents ont vécu ça, nous on voit ça maintenant. Donc il parlait, le MIG par exemple, il parlait beaucoup de gestion coloniale des quartiers. Donc vraiment c'est un truc qui est sorti de mes entretiens.
Can you add more in terms of detail regarding this idea of kind of a tendency for over-policing or reaffirming the need for policing? Because it isn't only in the banlieue that has occurred. If anything, the experiment was done in the banlieue, which is twisted by definition anyway, but it is now implemented also within Paris proper. So, first, what are your impressions regarding that kind of creation of that kind of over-policing? And what do you think would be the kind of solution to that problem? Because you kind of inferred there might be.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm very pessimistic on this. I don't want to exaggerate the situation, but I think we are going towards, in this country especially, towards the militarization of urban space with ever-impressive police strategies, tactics, and investments. And I agree with you that it's not just the banlieue, it's in the cities as well. But I think the banlieue, once again, were particularly hard hit, with these new laws, like in the gathering, in the building, that kind of thing. And I think and I have read reports, policy reports, that have somehow argued that somehow the banlieues were targeted by the police a bit more than so I think there is this territorial stigmatization. I think it's the same thing with unemployment, isn't it? In France, there's a big unemployment problem. So we can't deny this, but the banlieues are particularly hard hit. And I don't think, what's interesting here is that, and I think I might connect this to your question, this changes strange responses. I'm not convinced that sending in soldiers were really necessary. And, I mean, this is, if we admit that, there is also this blessure du passé, the injuries of the past, about your colonial past. Why would you then invoke a law that was originally conceived during the Algerian law, which was never implemented in mainland France before? And you do it to repress your own citizens in the banlieue. There's a lot of symbolic violence, not just the physical violence of it, but lots of symbolic violence about that. So I think there is this militarization going on. Yeah? There are very material effects of this, but we have to recognize. But there are also very important symbolic effects of this, which is my idea of voices into noises. I mean, the banlieue youth know that when they riot, they burn and they loot, and it's not rational, it's not good. They know that. They're not idiots. Yeah, I mean, the Castella story is so important to me. We have to accept the political intelligence of this youth. What happens is they get carried away. Yeah? When you occupy a space, we have seen this in Occupy movement. There is a very strong, almost like taking. I mean, I'm not speaking from experience, but almost like taking a drug, like a sense of empowerment. And when that group get carried away when you're 18, that happens. So I think, yeah, pessimistic, and I'm worried about the material effects of it and symbolic effects of it as well.
And it's because it's the idea that if you define the question, you control the conversation. If you define the question in terms of whether somebody as a citizen is a criminal or not, that seems to be the constant question. Are you making trouble? Are you not making trouble? And constantly you're forcing people to either defend themselves or justify their presence.
Yeah. Or why are you doing this? Who wants to go out, face these guys, throw stones, burn, loot? There must be a reason for this, mustn't there? I mean, it's not violence collective. It's not just looting and burning. There are structural reasons behind this, and I think we tend to not be like, I'm sure we all think about those, but in general public, I think this tends to get forgotten a bit, and I think that's very, very worrying.
Thank you. My question is related. I'm just wondering whether you think that political and media and sort of general public discourses are somewhat complicit, or maybe. So my question is related to the previous question on over-policing, and I'm just wondering whether you think that political and media and public discourses, consciously or unconsciously, are somewhat accepting or complicit in these strategies or these over-policing approaches.
Thank you. I think that the media. I haven't done detailed research on the processes of how they use this, but one thing I realized when I was working on the book was that most of the terms, if not all, the terms the media are using are state statements. So that's why they are so powerful, and it's not the journalists who are inventing them. Of course, sometimes they get very creative and invent things, but when the state statements have introduced these words, like urban violence, in France, believe it or not, we didn't have this notion until 1990, until the French intelligence service introduced the term. And it takes a certain kind of power because it's a state statement. It's almost institutionalized. So I think there are good reasons to look at the media, but once again, I personally am more interested in the institutionalization of this and the state statements. I think in terms of policy, I think there are policy choices to be. I think there are some not very responsible, formulations and articulations of the banlieue, like some politicians, for example, saw polygamy as a source of right and stuff like that. So you get that. You can't avoid it. I think you will always get this kind of diatribe. There's nothing you can do. I think more interesting is maybe us as academics who are writing about these issues. Perhaps I don't know. Would I ever publish a book called "Banlieues of Islam" with a minaret on the cover? Because I would have never done that. So I think we have our own set of responsibilities, and I think there are seemingly very simple everyday things that seem to me revolutionary. Which, for example, in the case of France, I think a real revolution would be when we stop talking about the children of immigrants. Can we ever do that? I don't think so. So why do I still talk about the banlieue youth as children of immigrants? Yeah, French adolescents. So there's for some reason always this reminder, and this was something in the interviews as well. Abdel was going crazy because almost somehow he needs to be reminded that he is the children of and the children of others. So I think there are simple things like this, and then you have to organize, but it's very difficult. There's no money, there's no funding. People are unemployed. I'm really pessimistic, but I try to keep a little bit of